All right. Good afternoon, everybody. So, hope you all had a good lunch. I'll just slowly get into my talk here since there's a few people trickling in. But welcome. So, this is a talk about consensus on the RChain network. So, just to get a sense of the audience here and what level you're at, could you please raise your hand if you have seen a talk about RChain consensus before? Okay, just a handful. Yeah, okay. Cool, good. All right, so for those of you who haven't, this is exactly where you want to be. We're going to be pitching this at a pretty low level, just trying to get everybody on the same page, make sure that people understand what our consensus algorithm is about, why we do things the way we do, and also point you to more resources where you can learn more in depth about what's going on, which might be more helpful for those of you who have seen this kind of talk before. All right, so let's jump in. So I've tried to structure this talk in the form of a sort of Q&A. So I've got several questions on here that I think people who are new to the platform might ask themselves. Why do we need consensus? And we'll talk about 3 compelling reasons why we need it at all. What is CBC Casper? I'm sure many of you have heard this term before, and maybe not all of you know what exactly it entails. Why do we need proof of stake? And how does it work? I understand that probably a lot of people in the room here are familiar with proof of work, and so we'll just take a brief detour and talk about proof of stake and how it differs from proof of work and sort of why we need it in our consensus. And then we'll also talk about what we're even coming to consensus about. You know, probably most people have an intuition about what the word consensus means. You know, it's a plain language term, but what are we coming to consensus on? Well, we're coming to consensus on things about RChain's state, and we'll get into that. And then finally, I'll just lay out a little bit an overview of the consensus protocol itself that we use for RChain and point you to where you can see some of the code for it, because after all, we're an open source project, and so we encourage people to dive into the code if they're interested in doing so. So, starting very, very basic right at the beginning, why do we need consensus? So one reason is security, right? So if you think about how money works in terms of fiat currencies, right, we have a social contract. If I give you €5, you can turn around and give €5 to someone else, and they will also accept that as a payment for whatever service, right? This kind of contract gives that €5 note value, right? If I give you €5 in exchange for, you know, a beer, and then you take your €5 that you've gotten from me and you give it to someone to pay for internet, you know, for example, right? This is a flow of money that is enabled by the fact that we all agree this has value, and we have some insurance that in the future someone will accept this thing that I've been given. And of course, the other reason it's valuable is limited supply. I can't just go and print off at home a €5 note that someone will accept, because if you could do that, well, then it wouldn't really be valuable anymore, right? People would just print off as many as they needed, and because that's not commensurate with the resources and services that we tend to spend money on, we would lose the value in that way, right? So it needs to have a limited supply. Now, in the blockchain space, we want to do the same kind of things, right? We want to be sure that if I give you a Bitcoin, you can turn around and give someone else a Bitcoin, and they'll accept it, and they'll think of it as valuable. And similarly, I shouldn't be able to just go to my, you know, laptop and generate 1 billion Bitcoin so that I can just start giving it out willy-nilly, right? That wouldn't be commensurate with the goods and services we want to spend it on. Same thing with Ether, same thing with Ref, right? These things we want to think of as having value, so they have to have exactly the same guarantees as any other form of valuable object, right? And so consensus is really what gives us the ability to do this. So we need to come to consensus. We need to agree on the fact that I gave you some valuable token, right? Everyone needs to agree that exchange actually took place so that in the future, people know you have it and they can accept it from you. And similarly, we need to agree that in the process of that transaction, no new money was created that shouldn't have been created, right? I can't copy my Bitcoin and give one to you and one to someone else. That would increase the supply. That would be very bad. So again, we need to come to consensus that exchanges are occurring and that the supply is not increasing as a result. All right. People seem to be following so far, so this is good. Next point I want to make is about decentralization. Right? Centralized systems, they have consensus too. It just so happens that their consensus is trivial, right? We all agree to trust the central source, whatever that is. It could be a bank, it could be any institution, could be like Amazon or something, right? People trust central sources to do the right thing, and we all agree to trust them. So if a bank says that in my account is 100 euros, then you trust that and you would accept 100 euros from me, right? Because you know, or you have, we have consensus that I actually have that amount to give you. In decentralized systems, though, things are a little bit different, right? So in decentralized systems, information exists in multiple places. It's replicated, and there's no single source of truth. But still, we want to do interesting things, right? I want to be able to exchange tokens. I want to be able to do computations. I want to be able to update the state. But if the state exists in multiple places, how can I do that? Well, I need to update one of them, and it needs to come to consensus with the others on the fact that that update happened. And eventually, the whole network agrees, yes, this update happened, right? This is the point of consensus, is that it enables decentralization. And decentralization itself is its own form of security, right? We lose that single point of failure if we have say something like Facebook, right? And Facebook gets hacked and everyone loses their passwords, right? That's bad. But when you have a decentralized thing, you can protect against failure in one place because the state exists all over. And so once again, each replica has to agree on changes to the state. Otherwise, they diverge, and then they're not replicas anymore, right? We have totally separate things that used to have something to do with each other, but don't anymore. So consensus keeps them in sync, keeps everything moving forward, maintaining the properties that we want to have. And finally, this is something a little bit more specific to RChain. The other two things are pretty common for the blockchain space. We have concurrency. Rolang is fundamentally a concurrent programming language, and concurrency comes with it some non-determinism, right? We can have situations where two independent tasks are trying to acquire the same resource, and only one of them will end up doing it. Or maybe it matters the order in which the task gets the resource, even if they both end up with it at some point. And so we need to agree on the outcome of any given computation. So why do we need consensus? Because we need to agree. If we don't agree, then the whole system is totally broken and nothing works. Consensus is the reason any of this is possible. And it's important to note here, this is a little bit of a subtle point, and maybe we can come back to it again later, but consensus is not choice. And this is something that gets conflated a little bit, especially when people are talking about things like validity and semantic value of data on chain and this kind of thing, right? Consensus isn't about that. Consensus is about agreement, as in at the end of the day, everyone agrees that this is the case. They didn't necessarily choose that to be the case, but it is. So my example here is, we can all agree that there is a conference right now here in Berlin, even though probably no one in this room actually chose to have the conference here. But we agreed that it was here, and we all came and we showed up, and here we are. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about is CBC Casper. So CBC Casper, in proper generality is just a framework for creating consensus protocols. It is not one single protocol. There is no the CBC Casper. It's a framework. It's a mathematical tooling that you can use to crank out consensus protocols that all have certain properties. So two key things that you sort of put into this framework are what we call protocol executions. These are the ways in which the protocol can evolve. So in the blockchain example, you can receive a block and you can add it to your chain. The estimator is something that takes in a protocol state and tells you some fact about the consensus. Again, taking the blockchain example, this is your fork choice, right? I have all of the blocks I've ever received, and I can pick, this is the one that is the current head of the chain. But you can see that these terms are very general, and there are lots and lots of different ways in which you could apply this to come to consensus on a whole number of things. And this is great because blockchains do have certain drawbacks, and we might want to re-engineer some of the architecture around this, but we can still use CBC Casper, right? At the end of the day, CBC Casper is just a framework, and so it'll evolve with us as our technology evolves, and that's a really powerful thing. But more than that, all of these protocols share certain features. They have low message passing overhead. We have something called the consensus safety proof, which is essentially a guarantee that you can come to consensus using this method, right? So the basic idea is that you can look at your own state and you can say to yourself, will any new information change what I think about the consensus? And if the answer is no, then we say that your estimate is safe, right? So for example, in Bitcoin or Ethereum, it's common to use your 6 confirmations rule, right? So you can look at your chain and you can say, well, my block that I'm interested in is, say, 100 confirmations deep, right? In all probability, no new information is going to change that fact, and so you might say that block is safe. It is going to be in my fork choice forever. And that's not a perfect example because it's more probabilistic, but in Casper, right, you can actually make deterministic, provable guarantees that say no new information ever will change my mind about a particular fact. And that's a local property, but the consensus safety proof tells us that it generalizes to a global property. If something is safe for you, it will eventually be safe for everyone. That's the consensus safety proof, and that's a really powerful thing. It tells you that looking only at your own state tells you something about the entire network, and that's super cool. And then finally, we have a tunable fault tolerance threshold. I've been kind of glossing over some details here. So fault tolerance is, right, some people might not be following the protocol. Some nodes might go down, some nodes might be malicious. And we want to be able to defend against those kind of things. We can't have our whole network fail because someone's power was turned off, right? So typically, you have some threshold that's built into the protocol based on the way it's constructed. In Casper, you can actually pick your threshold. And that enables us to have a direct trade-off between latency to finality and safety. And that's really cool. It lets us decide how safe something needs to be versus how fast we need a thing to happen. And this is all just a very high-level overview. Vlad is giving a talk tomorrow. Vlad, of course, is one of the key players behind this whole thing, so he'll give an excellent talk that I'm sure will be super interesting. So for any of you who want more details on this, I encourage you to go check that out. So let's talk about proof of stake. So we've got consensus, and we're using CBC Casper. But proof of stake is an additional thing on top of this. Casper doesn't mention proof of stake anywhere. It's another piece that we've added to this puzzle to make everything work out. And it does two important things. First of all, it gives us a disciplined way to decide who's participating. Right? We have a notion of a validator. And validators have put up stake. They are bonded onto the network. That distinguishes them from someone who is not bonded on the network and not participating in the consensus in the same way. It also provides an incentive mechanism, right? The notion of slashing, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is basically saying if you don't follow the protocol, if you try to take down the network, will lose something, right? You are now incentivized to keep the network running and to follow the protocol and do things well, because if you don't, there's some personal risk involved. So again, we're composing Casper together with proof of stake to make our overall consensus algorithm have the properties we want it to have. So how does it work? So like I've mentioned, we've got this notion of self-interest, right? If you're bonded on the network, you are personally at risk if something goes wrong on the network. You could lose your stake. So if you have stake in the network, what's bad for the network is bad for you. But bonding is a little bit more than that, right? So everybody in the room here probably has ROC, which will become Rev. So in principle, everyone has stake in the network. If the network goes down, people lose investments or whatever. But bonding is even more than that. Bonding is a commitment to the network as opposed to a passing interest, right? Bonding is about being an actor in the consensus, and you can directly lose your bond even if the network itself doesn't go down. Being a validator means that you're going to make sure that the network goes as it should, and if you are caught not fulfilling that role, you will personally lose the amount that you have given to show your commitment. And the way in which you lose it is slashing. So validators do have power over the network. They can do things that regular users can't because they're participating in the consensus, and so we need to make sure that there's some check on that power, right? We need to make sure that that you don't form some nasty coalition of validators that does nefarious things like try to steal people's money, right? You want to make sure that the network can proceed even in the presence of these people that are influencing the consensus. And so we have slashing conditions. Slashing conditions are offenses that validators and only validators can commit, and if they do this, they lose their bond, or some piece of their bond. There are some details here that I'm glossing over, which maybe we can talk about it in more detail at the end of the talk. But the essential idea is that if a validator is caught doing a bad thing, we take at least some of their bond away. And this is to disincentivize them from doing things that we don't want them to. So equivocation is an example, and we'll be talking about equivocations in a little bit. The final piece here, and this is especially important just as like an educational point, is holding on to bonds. So there's an attack which is called a long-range attack in some of the literature, and it goes something like this. I withdraw my bond and then do some slashable thing, and no one can touch me for it, right? Because my bond is already taken away. But this will succeed if people still think I'm a validator, right? So if I'm acting like a validator but don't carry any of the risk of the validator, I can do some nasty things to the network. And so to prevent this from happening, we withhold funds. So there's something that we call the holding period. So after you unbond from the network, your bond is not returned to you right away. There's a period during which it's just held by the proof of stake contract, and it's returned to you after the holding period expires. And the reason for this is that it gives time for the entire network to say, yep, that person's no longer a validator, we move forward, we get to some new state, and that validator can't influence it after that period has expired. Does that make sense to people? Yeah, cool. All right. So just in summary, validators bond onto the network, they participate in consensus, get slashed for doing bad things, and their funds are held for a period even after they unbond. And these are all important things in order to make our consensus work the way we want it to work. So what are we actually coming to consensus on? This is going to get a little bit into some row length theory. There's more talks on row length throughout the conference. So if any of this sort of feels unclear to you, then I definitely encourage you to take a look at the program and go see some other talks that clarify some of these points. But the idea is this. The RChain state is just one big Rolang term. Right? If you take all of the contracts, including the Rev wallets and the proof of stake and say whatever dApps are around, and you sort of smash them all together, this is the RChain state, and it can be represented as a Rolang term. And what we're trying to do is come to consensus on what that term is. So internally, we represent it in something called a tuple space. The tuple space tells us what the current state is and also has semantics that match exactly the row-lang computational semantics. So for anyone familiar with the row calculus, there's something called the reduction rule. The reduction rule is how the computation proceeds, and that is exactly captured in the semantics of the tuple space. And again, because we're an open source project, you can go look at this. You can go see what these semantics are. They're up on GitHub. They're in our RSpace repository. Probably some of you have seen on Community Hangouts demos from RSpace. It's all very cool stuff. I definitely encourage you to go look at it. And so ultimately, we need to agree, we need to come to consensus on what the tuple space is now, because that's our current state, but also what the history is, because we do care about the fact that our current state is valid with respect to what the previous state was, right? We don't want money appearing out of nowhere, for example. So we are coming to consensus on precisely these two things. Now, how do we do that? Well, no surprise, we're using blocks, and we're arranging them in something that's kind of chain-like, but in fact, in our case, it is a directed acyclic graph, or DAG for short. And for anyone who's unfamiliar with this term, this comes from graph theory and mathematics. So the idea is that you've got nodes, and you've got arrows between your nodes, and they're connected, and this is what we mean by a graph. And so in our case, we have blocks, and we have parent pointers, and the parent pointers are arranged in such a way that they don't necessarily form a linear chain. They can branch out. And that's fine. They can actually reconnect together as well. And I'll show some photos, or some images of this in a little bit, and hopefully that'll clear a few things up for people, if this isn't clear already. So what happens is blocks tell you updates about the tuple space. They say this term and this term interacted, and then a new term was produced, which in turn acted with that term, et cetera, right? It shows you the trace of the computation that occurred during the code that was deployed in that block. And so if we start from the genesis block, and we know what the genesis state is, we can play through these blocks and get to the current state, and the blocks themselves show us the history. So the DAG ends up representing both of the things that we wanted to come to consensus on, both what the tuple space is now and also what its history was. And I'll just mention here that the reason, or part of the reason we use a DAG is because blocks with multiple parents can merge disjoint changes. So this is a concurrency at the blockchain level, which is super cool and not something that's done in other mainstream blockchain technologies, right? So row-lang itself is concurrent, but then we can even at a higher level have more concurrency. And you can think of this as like a fork-join threading model, right? I have some thread going along doing some computation, I fork off a new thread, they go along independently doing their computations, and at some point they come back together and join their results, and we keep going. So that's the kind of thing that you can accomplish with a DAG, which is super cool. And so we need to agree on the DAG, and by agreeing on what the DAG is, we can agree on the two things that we want to, what the tuple space is now and what its history was. All right, so with all that, let's talk about the protocol itself. So you can actually go look, again, on GitHub, all of the detail about what blocks look like and RChain is in this file. We use protobufs to pass messages between nodes, so you can actually go look at the definition of what a block is and everything that it contains. But just in short, we have a header. It has hashes of the parent blocks, sort of the main thing that's interesting about it. This is very similar to things like Ethereum and Bitcoin that you're used to, except now we're allowing multiple parents because we have a DAG instead of a chain. We have a body that tells us what new code was added to the state, as well as logs telling us what the execution of that code was when it hit the tuple space. The final hash that we end up with, and the current bond. So all this information is telling us both about the changes that were made from the previous state and the final state we end up in. But the extra piece, the piece that's maybe surprising for those of you who aren't familiar with this, are the justifications. And this is another thing that comes from the Casper framework. This is part of how we ensure our consensus is going as we want it to. And the idea is that they inform other nodes of that block proposer's view. So remember I was talking about individuals looking at their own state and coming to conclusions about their own state and deriving conclusions about the whole network. Well, what justifications do is give you more information than just yourself, because a justification basically says the person who created this block had also seen these other blocks, and that's why they created it in the position in the DAG where they did. The justifications justify where their block was placed. And so this allows us to do some validation that people are following the protocol, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a moment. But it basically makes the consensus proceed much more smoothly and with much less message passing, because each message has a lot of information in it. And so as I'm sure you're aware, validators have the power to propose blocks to the network, not regular users. Regular users give the code that they want to run to validators. Validators pack them up into blocks and propose them to the network. So the piece of consensus that I mentioned earlier was the estimator that tells you how to take your state and turn it into a fact. Our estimator in the blockchain example is the fork choice, and our fork choice is outlined here. So I'll go into a little bit of detail just to give you a flavor of it, but the point is that this is precisely the mechanism by which we know what part of the DAG we're on currently. So given some view of the DAG, again, we're thinking locally about this, so some validator has seen some blocks and has them locally on their machine. The estimator is going to tell them what block is the tip, or which block is the current state that we should think about. And then its history tells us the canonical history. So all validators are going to use the same function, and this is why they end up agreeing in the end. This means that if everybody has the same view, they end up with the same fork choice. And because of the way blocks are passed around the network, everyone eventually has the same view, right? Like this is sort of your guarantee that you will reach consensus eventually. And again, I'm glossing over a few things that make this a little bit more nuanced, but we can come back to that if people are interested. But the main point is that we use the justifications. So the justifications are telling us things about what other validators have seen. And the function here is basically taking that view of what other validators have and telling us what the current state is. And this function is the very verbosely named inclusive greedy heaviest observed subtree rule, or GHOST. Inclusive GHOST, to be clear. And I'll go through what that algorithm looks like, just for people to get a little sense of it. So validators have weights, which correspond to their bond amounts, and Ghost uses those weights to score, and then finally follows the scores to come up with the current tip of the chain, or DAG. So for scoring, we start with the latest message from each validator, and we follow back along parents, adding weights to the blocks. And then we go back and we start at Genesis, or in fact, actually the last finalized block, because we do have finalization. And this is a nice optimization on this. We follow the child links instead of the parent links, and we prioritize branches based on the score. So what this means, this is where the heaviest part comes in, right? So heaviest subtree, as in the heaviest path along the DAG, according to the score. Blocks with 0 score are not traversed, and in the end, we have tips of the DAG, and these are the current blocks. And of course, the one with the highest score is sort of the current block, and the others you can imagine as other threads that are also running that might possibly be joined together in the future. And again, open source project, you can go read the code that does this. And I do encourage you to do that. It's Always good to familiarize yourself with the details as much as possible. But I'll walk through a quick example for you guys. So here's our Genesis block in blue, and we have 3 validators. We've got our green validator, our purple validator, and our orange validator. And they have weights 7, 5, and 3. And so we're going to walk through what Ghost would do on this DAG. So first of all, we're going to start with validator, with the green validator here. We start at their latest block, which is this one, and they have weight 7. So we add 7 all the way back to Genesis, or the last finalized block, which is what it'll be in most cases, because we'll get past Genesis pretty quickly. And then we go on to the second validator, our purple validator. There's their latest message, and so the 5 propagates backwards. So 5 plus 7 is 12, and it also comes back along the other path, remember, because we're allowed to have multiple parents, and so this gets a 5, and this gets a 5. But we don't double add, right? So because we already got 5 from this path, we don't also get 5 from that path. It's only added once. And then finally, we'll add in our 3. There's the latest message, so 3 goes here. 3 plus 5 is 8, and 8. And then 12 plus 3 is 15, and we go all the way back to Genesis. Notice that this block was never scored, because it was no one's latest block, and no latest block's path led to it. And so it's left with a 0 score, which means it gets skipped. Right? Ghost is going to totally ignore that block. This is what we would call an orphaned block in the typical blockchain parlance. And so now we're going to traverse, right? So we start at Genesis, and we're like, okay, well, we're skipping that block, so we go here, and there's nowhere else to go except here. Okay, well, now we're at a fork. So now we need to decide which direction to go in terms of our priorities. We're actually going to go both directions, because this is inclusive Ghost, but we want to still prioritize one branch over another. So the one with the heavier score, which is 12, higher than 8, this is our preferred branch. So this block is going to be preferred over that block, but still we're going to proceed along both branches. And then sort of a couple steps later, we end up at the tips of our DAG. And so because 12 was favored, we'd go this way and we'd hit this one. And then similarly, we'd end up over here. But even from this block, 5 is favored over 3. So in sort of all situations, this is our favored tip over this one. But they're both valid. If these blocks were disjoint and contained disjoint transactions, then we could join them together at some future block over here and continue on. But if they're disjoint, then the consensus is this one over this one. All right, making sense to everybody? Cool. All right, so now let's talk about equivocations, given the picture that we just saw. So equivocations are impossible state transitions, right? So remember Casper, we have protocol executions that tell you how to get from one state to the next based on new information. If people were allowed to do whatever they wanted, the consensus would totally fall apart because we wouldn't actually have a sensible protocol. And so we need to be able to detect when people are deviating from the protocol. So an impossible transition we call an equivocation. And equivocations are slashable, as in, if you are doing this, that means you're not actually following the protocol, you're not doing your job, you're not meeting your commitment that you gave when you bonded to be a validator, and so we slash you. It's worth noting that slashing is going to be implemented a little bit later. So as of today, this isn't the case, but we're talking, Mercury timelines here. And these things are detectable. This is the other amazing thing about Casper, right? We can detect more than just nodes going offline, right? Nodes going offline is what we call a non-attributable fault because it could be communication errors. But this is something that is a fully attributable fault that is potentially harmful to the consensus, and we can detect it, which means we can slash for it. So the way we do this is we look at a particular validator, and we look at their justifications, which also form a DAG, right? So there's actually 2 DAGs here, the parent and the justifications, because there's 2 sets of edges happening in our block network. So if we look at a single node's justifications, remember what justifications mean, it's their current view of the DAG. So if I, as a validator, make a new block, well, obviously I knew about my old block because I made it. So a justification in my new block has to go back to my old one. Otherwise, something fishy is going on. And what that means is we have a chain of justifications from the first block a validator creates through to their last. And any fork in that chain is an equivocation, right? What it tells you is that they created two blocks that somehow didn't know about each other, but that's impossible because they were created by the same individual, right? This is someone not following the protocol. In particular, this is equivalent to saying that there are two instances of the protocol running under the same identity, which is just as bad. And so we can detect this. It's even like clear in the picture, right? So this is the same picture as before, but with one extra node. We've got our black parent pointers, and now I've also added in gray justification pointers. I'll also note that parent pointers implicitly are also justification pointers, and I just left them off for brevity and clarity in the image. So if we look at this block, for example, what it's saying is when the green validator created this block, they knew about their own block, obviously, but they also knew about this purple block. And they decided, based on the ghost rule at the time, that their block was higher precedent than the purple block. And because they conflicted, I couldn't just pick both. So I picked the higher precedent one. And that's perfectly valid because I have justified my choice, saying this is what I knew about these two, and this one is higher weight. So I pick it. But now let's look at this case over here, right? I've got my two purple blocks. So if we imagine this block being created, it knows about its last block, that makes sense. But this block also claims to know about the last block, and there's no pointer in between these two. So there's no way to order these two blocks with respect to each other. It looks like they've both sort of appeared from two different instances of the protocol. And that's why they're an equivocation, and you can see if you're looking at sort of the chain of gray lines connecting purple nodes that this is a clear fork in that chain. And so it's easily detectable, and we would slash the purple validator for creating such a block. So just to wrap up, we've got row-length term being represented in a tuple space. We capture the tuple space state and history in a DAG. We agree on the canonical tips using ghost. The ghost weights come from proof of stake. We slash for equivocations. And I'll also mention here that there's a few extra rules that I didn't go over in detail just in the interest of time. But we have extra things like ignoring invalid blocks because of improper tuple space operations or mismatch parents for justifications, as in like you made a choice but it was the wrong choice based on what Ghost would tell you, etc. So these invalid conditions are things that won't be slashable in Mercury but are still problematic for the network, and so we just ignore those blocks. They don't contribute to the DAG. And that is all. Thank you very much. And I'm definitely happy to take any questions that people have. Please use the mics. There's two of them, so we can sort of get a little concurrent queue going on.
Oh, the first to the mic gets to ask the first question.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I think it was one of the first slides you talked about race conditions in processes. Mm-hmm. And it is not clear to me how these race conditions can be included in the consensus.
Okay. So in Rolang, it's easy to express a race condition, right? So, but the way to think about it is I've got two processes, both of which going after the same resource. And so ultimately, when I run this program, one of them is going to get that resource, and one of them isn't. But either of them could, in principle, obtain that. So we have a non-deterministic outcome. So given a chunk of code, either process 1 gets the resource or process 2 gets it. And if I give it out to 1,000 different nodes, half of them will pick one and half of them will pick the other. And this is wrong, right? We want to make sure everyone agrees on what the outcome of a computation is. And so an important piece of this is to make sure that we agree on the outcome of a computation. And so in our consensus algorithm, I mentioned back on the block slide here that we have traces, tracing the execution. So we're going to basically say, I think that process 1 won the race. And then another node might say, well, I think process 2 won the race. And then the consensus algorithm is used to ultimately pick one of those two based on the ghost rule and the weights and so on. But then we remember the choice we make because it's in our logs. Does that make sense?
How do the others verify that this trace execution is valid?
That's an excellent question. So just to repeat it for the audience, the question was, how do the other nodes verify that this trace execution is valid? So let's see if I go back maybe 1 or 2 slides here. So I mentioned these RSpace source codes. There's actually also something called a replay RSpace, both of which also have source files. This is referencing a method called produce, and this one is consume, or maybe it's the other way around, not the point. But replay RSpace has exactly the same 2 operations, and what it does is it takes a log and replays through the log and double checks that it gets the same answer at the end. And that is exactly the verification process. And so actually, going back to the last slide here, this is what I was talking about when I was talking about improper tuple space operations. Other nodes go through the replay, and if they conclude, well, this log makes no sense, then they say this is an invalid block and don't include it in their DAG.
Could we come back again to the tuple space slide? There is one small word that I would like you to explain. Yes, here. What does it mean now?
Sorry, which one?
We need to agree on what the tuple space is now. Now is what?
So now means at the current block height is sort of a typical way of phrasing it. But as in, if I was to make a transaction against the network immediately, as in like from my perspective right now, what state would I be transacting against? And typically we measure that in block height.
Okay, I'm not very much proficient with the raw language. Is it deterministic concurrent language, or there is non-deterministic execution possible?
It's deterministic. So a now state is one that we call quiescent, which is just a fancy word that means all computations have completed. And because of our logging infrastructure, there's only one valid completed state, right? There could have been multiple before we ran it, but after the run, there's only one. We've picked one of the possible options. And so now means the current state after all computations prior to now have completed.
So just to double check, you mean that on some specific point of time, all the computations should cease, so there is a kind of a barrier where all the process meet.
That's right. And there's a barrier between blocks, actually, is exactly where the barrier is. So every block is at a quiescent state, is at one of these computation complete points. So the current block, whatever sort of like the tip of your DAG is, right? So like if I go back to our picture here, so this was our fork choice, right? So the state of this block is what I mean by the state of now, and that state is completed. And before this block existed, this would have been a completed state, right? So every block has a completed state to it, and the current fork choice is what I mean by the now state, the state I will transact against if I was to make another block out here.
And I have the last question. Doesn't it mean that the actual execution is sequential? So that the order of execution is the order of transactions, and they are executed one by one. And so all the network is waiting until the block is completed?
Not necessarily. So for example, this block joins these two previously concurrent things, right? So joins are possible when there's no dependency. So certainly some transactions do need to be sequenced. If you have $10 and I give you $30 and then you give someone else $40, there's a definite order there, right? Like you couldn't have given 40 before I gave you 30 because you didn't have enough. Other transactions, on the other hand, don't need to be ordered because they have no causal dependency on each other. So me giving you $30 is independent from me giving someone else $15 if I have 100. Yep. So the idea here is that I can run independent computations concurrently, and actually within a block you can do that as well because rolling itself is concurrent, and you're only sequencing the things that have a causal dependency. And this is exactly where the scaling comes from in RChain as compared to something like Ethereum, where everything is serial regardless of any causal dependency.
And if at the later moment you identify there is a clash on the orange and green blocks, in orange you give 50, in green you give another 50, but you have only 70 at the beginning.
So if there was a clash between these two, then we couldn't have created this block. This block would be deemed invalid. This is another part of the validation, is that in the case of multiple parents, you need to make sure that these two blocks actually didn't conflict. If they did conflict, then this block would be invalid and couldn't have been added to the DAG.
And if they conflict, how do you wind back? Which of those blocks are rolled back?
If they conflict, then when a new block is created, you have to pick between the two, and the way you pick is precisely using Ghost. So if we fast forward here, right, this had a higher weight than that, so if they did conflict, we would have picked this one, and that one would have eventually been orphaned. Yes.
Okay, so in terms of timing on blocks, like what is the block time, especially considering that blocks can be created in parallel?
There is no block time, and the reason there's no block time is because we're not doing proof of work.
Okay, so what's the basis for then saying that this is a block?
You can just, if you are a validator, you can make a block whenever you want. And it will be passed around the network and other validators will see it, right? They'll still undergo consensus, but not having a block time means that your block rate will actually be proportional to network traffic, and that's what you want, right? Because today, what's proportional to network traffic are gas prices, right? And that's insanity. You don't want that. You want your block rate to go up when you have more traffic, so that people can keep fees at a reasonable, consistent spot.
Okay, so another question, like in terms of just the data availability. So on that slide we have at the moment, like with the purple block, that purple block would still effectively have needed to evaluate the entire blockchain up to that point to actually be able to produce that purple block, correct?
Yeah, if I join the network fresh, I don't have any state. In principle, yeah, I would have to start from Genesis and run all of those and this to get here, yeah. Because we only give diffs. Well, in practice, we'll optimize this away by having checkpoints where you can like download the state up until a point and this kind of thing. But yeah, if you were going to do it totally from scratch, you'd have to replay all of the state up to the purple block.
Okay, and everybody producing a block would still need to evaluate all the transactions that they possibly can to actually check for validity and stuff.
Right, so every validator, when they get this block, the idea, right, is that every validator is keeping pace, right? So at the time that this block is circulating the network, these two blocks, in principle, are already computed and in that validator's view. And so when this new block shows up, all they have to do is compute the new block as well as the merge, and that's it. But if they were behind, if they were slower than some of the other validators, then yeah, there would be some work to catch up to the end. And so partially what this means is that the block time, I say there is no block time because it's not a fixed thing, but there becomes sort of a ceiling, if you will, where it's how much can the network actually compute and keep up with. So because remember there's no point in making more blocks if they're just going to go off and not be finalized. And the only way you get finalization is by having confirmations in the form of justifications, right? So say if the purple validator had way more hardware than everyone else and just shot off with a super long chain there, that chain would be meaningless to everybody because it's not being confirmed by other validators. Other validators need to say, oh yeah, yep, that's a good block, that's a good block, and so on. So ideally what you want is some kind of like mix like I show here. You know, we got green making a block and then purple and then orange and then purple again, and then maybe green would do the next one, right? You get this mix in order to sort of maintain your consensus, your safety, right? Because I didn't go into what the safety calculation is like, but it's related to how many validators have agreed to a block implicitly. So your block time becomes limited by the slowest computer on the network, essentially, because everyone has to keep up.
Okay, that's a whole nother branch of question that I would need to ask then.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, so just in terms of like scalability, let's say for instance up to that purple block with the 5 above it, there was like 1 million transactions in all the blocks before that, right? Everybody joining the network would still need to evaluate all 1 million transactions. Am I correct in that? There might be some way of syncing faster, like we have with fast sync on Geth and that kind of thing, but that's still like that's still going to be capped in terms of a node having to evaluate all of the incoming information.
We do have plans for a checkpointing operation. That means you won't have to go literally back to Genesis every time. But yes, you will have to go back to some point in the past. And you will have to replay everything up until the current tip.
Okay, so let's say we have some checkpoint in the past, basically, and we have all the transactions between that. Wouldn't that still mean that our network is still capped as to the capacity? Okay, so that might join into your previous statement about everybody has to keep up. Like the slowest guy has to keep up. So he's going to actually determine the block times and the transactional throughput. Doesn't that impose similar limits to what other networks have at the moment then on RChain?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, it imposes a limit, but it's not a protocol level limit. It's a hardware level limit, right? So this is related to the sharding solution. So people probably have heard about our ideas of having shards that meet a certain purpose, right? So the root shard is going to be the shard that essentially everyone is in, and so there was probably going to be some slow machines in there, and it will be a pretty slow shard as a result. But you could have other shards that have fewer machines, all of which are very high quality, very high spec, and so the block time there will be shorter, right? It gives you a way of tuning the block time that doesn't compromise security.
Okay, and just back to your statement on the slowest guy determines the pace of the block production, how would that work basically?
Well, because at some point, right, you're sort of waiting for the slowest guy to catch up because making more blocks isn't helping anyone, right? It's sort of for you to be 1,000 blocks ahead just means that your users, the people that are submitting transactions that are in those blocks, still have to wait till finality, right? So people are going to stop submitting transactions until things become finalized. Does that make sense?
Okay, but let's say there were like 10 validators. Right.
Say again?
Let's say there were 10 validators and one of them was extremely slow.
Well, there's extra nuances here that we're glossing over a little bit. Like one validator being slow is maybe not that big a deal because consensus, right? You could reach a reasonable consensus with 9 probably, depends on the stake distribution, et cetera. But just to go with the example, let's say that 4 out of 10 were slower than the other 6. Basically what you would do is the 6 nodes would run through all the transactions they had. You'd have a bunch of unfinalized transactions. Eventually the 4 would catch up. And then as the old transactions finalized, the 6 would sort of burn through another bunch of transactions, and you'd end up with a sort of like block burst time, if you will. Or maybe you wouldn't, right? Because the other thing is that validators have a choice about when they create blocks. So the other validators might artificially slow themselves down to match the other 4 because this bursting behavior isn't ideal for whatever use cases people are interested in, right? The fact is that there's flexibility in this.
Okay, cool, thanks.
So I think we probably have time for one more.
Okay, had a few questions to try to keep it fast. Can the merges cross block heights? So
Yes,
suppose
they can cross block heights, and the new block height is 1 greater than the maximum of
one
the two
greater than
merged.
the-
Yeah.
So there might be a period of time where basically a state is indeterminate because there's an orphan block that's still consistent with the tip that's further ahead, but you're not really sure whether transactions in that are going to be.
Yeah. So what you might say is that the block height in quotation marks is the height of the block with the highest weight. So like in our example, it'd be this one. But even if these two did not conflict with each other, it means that if you're being fully honest with what the state of the DAG is, you would say that there are multiple block heights, and you'd sort of give the list of all the ones that don't conflict with the leading one. But the leading one is still reasonable to talk about being the block height because you know that the next block is going to be 1 greater than sort of the maximum of that set that doesn't conflict. Yeah.
Right. It introduces some trickiness if you're not transacting, but if you're merely viewing the state and you want to know, the balance of something that in the maybe orphan, maybe not orphan block, there's a transaction that would affect it. You're not really sure. It's interesting.
It is interesting, but that's why you shouldn't really concern yourself with what a transaction may or may not be until after it's finalized, right? You want to it's sort of like you're waiting for your six confirmations. You're waiting for a new block to join these two until that happens.
Or render it inconsistent. So the word finalized you keep using a lot. Is there, in a RChain context, aside from, in other blockchains we often use a heuristic of n confirmations means it's final. You said that wasn't really how RChain does it. What do you mean by the word finalized?
What I mean is locally safe by a critical number of validators. So remember, safety was a local property that no new information could change that validator's mind, and that we have an eventually consistent property which says that if one validator thinks it's safe, eventually they'll all think it's safe. So if you get a safety confirmation from a validator you trust, you can just run with it and say, yep, this block's finalized. But if you're worried about malicious validators giving false safety confirmations, then you would want to wait for a critical number of safety confirmations from validators.
For a critical fraction of the stake, that would be the heuristic. You might look for if 70% of the stake has acknowledged this block, then that's...
And I'm also glossing over an extra detail, which is that safety is relative to some threshold. So there's sort of 2 thresholds you can pick, is sort of like the number of safety confirmations you've gotten and also the threshold at which you asked for that safety confirmation. Okay. And maybe offline we can talk in more detail about that if you're interested.
Sure. And then a final one, I'm sorry to abuse the questions. For the within transaction concurrency, where you discussed race conditions, and a question is if all of the other validators to keep up have to run a log linearly to reproduce the race conditions, is there any net performance increase that the first validator got to use concurrency?
You don't, and this is one of the fantastic engineering decisions that we make here at RChain. You don't have to run the log linearly. You don't literally replay the transactions one at a time. We have an algorithm that reproduces the result in a concurrent fashion.
I see. So you re-execute the logs concurrently as well. Okay. And get the same race condition outputs.
And you're guaranteed to get the same answer, yeah.
That's really interesting. Great, thanks.
You're welcome. All right, I think that's probably time, so thank you, everyone.